Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us across this globe this morning. We welcome you to this third session of the African and African Diaspora Conference. We are glad that you are able to join us, and we trust that our conversation today may continue to contribute to the work of transformation and liberation. As we gather this morning, I'm reminded of a verse from the Psalm where the people of God found themselves in Babylonian exile. And they reached out and they expressed their frustration of being asked to sing the songs of Zion in a strange land. And their response to that request is they hung up their harps and wept. The prophet Bob Marley reminds us that it is our task to liberate ourselves from mental slavery. This conference is aimed at helping us not just to hang up our harps and weep, but this conference is meant to invite us into a space of liberation and hope that will allow us to liberate ourselves from mental slavery. Let us pray. God of life, open our hearts and mind to embrace your liberative grace. Amen. So welcome again. My name is the Reverend Michael Blair. It is my privilege to serve as the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, and I'm located in Toronto. I acknowledge that I live on land that have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for over 15,000 years. And currently, the place I live in Toronto is the home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, as Canada is known. And I particularly this morning want to give thanks to the Mississaugas of the Credit, who steward this land in its current context. So I come to you this morning from Toronto. I've had the privilege as well to be a part of the international planning committee for this event. I'm grateful for the leadership of Frank Chikani and Angelique Walker-Smith as they have spearheaded this work. As we begin, just a few administrative pieces to bring to your attention. If you need translation, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a globe, and under it is the word interpretation. If you would simply click on the globe and choose the language in which you need interpretation, that would be helpful. Today, the focus of this third session of this conference, and we've had an exceptional start on Saturday, focusing on Pan-African women. And yesterday, as we heard from former South African President Mbeki, we have been enriched in our imagination and our thinking about the work that is before us. This morning, today, the theme of our conversation will be understanding the intersection between decolonizing knowledge and Black Lives Matter. A reminder that this Africa and African Diasporic Conference from Manchester 1945 to a Pan-African resistance bring together a number of global Pan-African initiatives to exchange and build on the ideas of and to help to create a platform for Pan-Africanism for the future. These initiatives include Pan-African Vision of the African Union, Agenda 2063, and the provision for the African diaspora as the sixth region of the African Union. The increasing collaboration between the African Union and the Caribbean community in terms of CARICOM, and CARICOM's call for reparatory justice, the Black Lives Matter movement across the world, and the UN International Decade for the People of African Descent from 2015 to 2024. This conference brings together representatives from Africa and all regions of the world where people of African descent are found, including the Americas, Caribbean, Europe, Asia, Oceania, from both civil and political institutions such as the AU and CARICOM, as well as the UN. And our hope is to revisit the groundbreaking decisions of the 1945 Sixth Pan-African Congress in Manchester and the 2001 World Conference Against Racism. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Sir Hilary Beckles. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles is the 8th Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and he's a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. Sir Hilary received his higher education in the United Kingdom. He has lectured extensively in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and has published over 100 peer-reviewed essays in scholarly journals, and over 13 books on subjects ranging from the Atlantic and Caribbean history, gender relations in the Caribbean, sports development, and popular culture. In 2007, he received a knighthood, Commander Knight of St. Andrews, the highest national honor in Barbados, in recognition of his distinguished service in the fields of education, sports, and the arts. In March of this year, the United Nations invited Sir Hilary to serve as an expert in its Futures for Higher Education project. Led by UNESCO, the International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, the project is intended to generate innovative and visionary ideas about the purpose and function of higher education. Join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Hilary Beckles.
What a tremendous honor it is to join with you in participation in what is clearly one of the most important dialogues facing us today within the global African world. It is an honor to join with you and to make this contribution. This is a contribution I hope that will add some value to the dialogue, both those aspects that have been persistently Pan-African and those aspects that are now beckoning for a reconciliation and a new vision. We all know the background to our circumstance. This has been the moment of reckoning that has emerged out of a long journey from the crimes of slavery and colonization through to the emergence of African people from the ashes of the Holocaust against our people, and our emergence with resilience and our determination to thrive in this 21st century. Now, it seems to me that there are two great debates at the moment that are in need of reconciliation. It is absolutely critical at this moment that we enter into this dialogue of reconciliation, of unity, and of consciousness forged with a vision of a new future. Let us look at the long tradition of Pan-Africanism as a paradigm to bring cohesion to the vision of African people against the background of slavery, slave trade and colonization, apartheid. The crime that has been committed, that scattered millions of African peoples across the world, the emergence of Western capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the global imperial vision of Europe that not only enslave and colonize our people and enchain the African continent, but also disperse African people as free labor across the world. In the case of the Caribbean, for example, we are speaking about the European nations extracting 300 years of free labor from 20 million Africans that fueled the industrial transformation, fueled the imperial appetite, and gave them effective economic control over 3/4 of humanity. But the seed of that was that enchainment of Africans, that 300 years of free labor, and the economic worth extracted from our people to establish their imperial juggernaut that brought the resources of the world under their effective control. We now are reflecting upon this. We have done the economics, we have looked at the political aspects, we have looked at the cultural and the ideological aspects. And from the very beginning, these African peoples that have been scattered all over the world saw the importance of fighting for their freedom and liberation. And critically, engrossed in a philosophy of justice, freedom, and equality. But to do this, we had to participate in the liberation of Mother Africa. And so philosophers, freedom fighters, and all of the intellectual and military power of the diaspora was galvanized and mobilized for the liberation of Africa, to take Africa out of the imperial clutches of Europe that was determined never to let Africa go, resulting in endemic warfare across the continent, the struggle to free our nation, our people, our continent from this extractive, racist, white supremacy imperialism. We succeeded. The result of 200 years of Pan-Africanism. The enslaved people of the diaspora fought against the Europeans wherever they were, from Alaska, Canada, through to the Caribbean, Brazil, wherever our people were enslaved and in chains, we fought against the Europeans. Haiti became the high point of that symbolism, whereby the enslaved people of Haiti defeated the French, defeated the Spanish, and defeated the English to establish the first free Black republic in the world. But we in the diaspora did not end there. We then participated through advocacy and ultimately with the Cuban people participated in the war for liberation in Africa. And therefore the diaspora gave all it could, ideas, concepts, attitude, consciousness, and ultimately arms to overthrow the racist regimes in Southern Africa. This has been a heroic journey of Pan-Africanism, a magnificent journey of Pan-Africanism, of Africa and its diaspora, struggling for democracy, struggling to uproot evil from the world, struggling to create a new global humanity. This has been the Black contribution to the re-emergence of humanity with its potential for justice, democracy, equality for all. This has been a history of the most significant political and cultural agency. But at the height of this movement, this Pan-African movement to free the diaspora and to free Africa, we went to Durban under the auspices of the United Nations to participate in the first global discourse on reparatory justice, on healing, forgiveness, and the search for justice. It was not a coincidence that the United Nations had sought to locate Durban in the post-apartheid land of Nelson Mandela to host this conference, with President Mbeki as host and Nelson Mandela as patron. The African diaspora arrived at Durban, determined to join forces with the United Nations to examine the issue of slavery, slave trading, and colonization of African peoples as a crime against humanity, with genocidal consequences and trauma, hurt, and suffering today as its legacy. The diaspora arrived in Africa with a vision, ambition, and hope to join forces with African leadership, African civil society, to create a culture of solidarity between Africa and the diaspora, to create a 21st century version of solidarity. We understood that the 20th century solidarity was in need of refinement, advancement, and greater sophistication. Those of us who arrive in Africa in order to fulfill this ambition, and who had been engaged in prior conversations with African political leadership and civil society. How shocked and disappointed we were to discover that the political leadership of Africa was not prepared to join with the political leadership of the diaspora in the search for justice, reparatory justice, and global healing. We were disappointed that when Europe said, we are not discussing the crimes of slavery and colonization, and neither are we discussing the issue of reparatory justice for the enslaved people and their descendants who continue to experience harm, pain, and suffering. We were surprised that when Europe took that position and threatened to destroy the conference if these issues were on the agenda, that our African political leadership stood with Europe against its own diaspora. How shocked we were to hear the president of Nigeria, the president of Senegal, president of Ghana, and the political leadership of all the other African nations turning their backs on their own Black diaspora, breaking the bond that had been built between Africa and the Caribbean for Africa's liberation, and joining with the European imperial powers against the diaspora. This was a process that has generated more trauma in the African diaspora than the African leaders could ever have imagined. There was the narrative that the African leadership had turned its back on the African diaspora as a strategy to appease Western nations, to consolidate Africa as a market for Western imperialism, above and beyond its own commitment to its diaspora as one people. Marcus Garvey, who had dedicated his entire political life to building this unbreakable bond between Africa and its African diaspora, would have turned in his grave to have witnessed what African political leadership did to the diaspora at Durban. It has created a wound. It has inflicted a deep wound on the diaspora. The diaspora, however, continues in its journey to try to understand and to create a new culture of healing in the world. But first, that healing has to be between Africa and its diaspora. Before the world can be healed from the wound of slavery, colonization, and the consequences thereof, before that global wound can be healed to humanity's identity, first there has to be this healing between Africa and its diaspora. We European powers have adopted is if we keep Africa and its diaspora separated, if we interfere in their relationship and we destabilize their conception of the future, then we know that Africa and its diaspora will not see eye to eye in terms of the way forward. This is their policy, this is their strategy. After 60 years of nation building in the diaspora and Africa, would it not be disastrous for the Europeans to interfere and intervene and keep us at arm's length, Africa and its diaspora, not reading from the same page? Next generation will not forgive us for this. The Caribbean has written to all of the powers of Europe, the old imperial powers and those powers that persist and believe in that Africa is a place where if they cannot get the free labor, they can get cheap resources. And in order to get those cheap resources, they have to maintain a dominant influence over African policy. This is their strategy. But they believe that the objective is to keep the African world divided within itself, divided against itself. And to a large extent, there were moments when they succeeded. But there were also moments when they failed miserably. And this is why Africa is a free continent today. But the Caribbean governments have written to the European government asking for a summit to discuss the reparatory justice approach of global Africa. The Europeans have had the comfort of knowing that they could resist this call for a formal summit because they know that Africa and the political leadership of Africa is not on board. It's because the Europeans believe that the influence they have over African political leadership is greater than the influence which the diaspora Africans have over Mother Africa. And so they can resist. But that resistance will come to a very, very swift end. The resistance of the European world to discuss this matter will come to a very swift end the moment Africa, the Africa Union, step up and say, we are supportive of this summit. We are supportive of this summit. Let us get together in much the same way that the Europeans came together in order to make the slave trade possible. In much the same way that the Europeans came together to take over Africa and its people and its resources, to divide the geography of Africa. In much the same way that at the Berlin Conference, the Europeans came together and carved up Africa and did with it what they wanted. We, the Africans, now have to come together in the first instance to have our own summit. It is the duty and the responsibility not only of the diaspora, but of the Africa leadership today. We have a sense of history, and we know that Africa, the African Union, will be rising to fulfill its destiny and its history, were it to host in Africa in 2022 a global summit to bring all of the African organizations together to discuss reparatory justice. We know that this is something we want. Can we not imagine that if one of our countries in Africa, under the auspices of the African Union, hosts a conference, the Global Africa Summit on Reparations, there will be hundreds and thousands of Africans from all over the world coming home to Africa to talk about its future. There will be no greater moment in this first quarter of the 21st century than to see 200,000 Africans from its diaspora and across the continent pouring into Africa to talk about reparatory justice, to speak about development, to speak about global Africa, to speak about the future of all of us. This is what this moment in history is calling for, is what we know. African people have always resisted the slave trade and slavery. They resisted it on the ground in Africa. The historical evidence shows that Africans were fighting back from the moment the Europeans arrived with their ships and their guns and their cannons and their military and their armies to capture our people and take them out of Africa and spread them across the world as free labor. There was African resistance to that. But we all know that wherever there is resistance, there will always be a few people who will be part of that traitorous minority. We always know that. It continues today. There are always one or two leaders in various parts of Africa that join in collaboration. But they were a minority. The majority of African governments and leaders and kings and tribal chiefs and the communities rose up against the slave trade and slavery. even on their way to the New World. We know, for example, that 25% of all of the slave ships experienced revolts across the Atlantic. They fought on the ships across the Atlantic. And when they arrive in the Americas, they continue that struggle. The history of slavery in the Americas is a history of civil war. It's a history of civil war in all of those societies and colonies where slavery was practiced. There was no generation of Africans, not one. There was no generation of Africans in the Americas that did not rise up in military revolt against slavery. They did it in Africa. They did it on the slave ships in the Middle Passage. And when they arrived in the New World, they fought to the very bitter end.
Thank you very much, Sir Hilary. I don't know about you, but I feel like I just need to pause for a minute and to hear again, let those words wash over me. So you have laid out a significant part of our collective history. You have named the truth of our struggles, and you have invited us to a new possibility. You have made clear to us the need for us to be about the task of liberation and claiming our future. And we thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation to us this morning and for both the truth, painful as it is, and the possibility of a new future. Much gratitude for your leadership in our conference this morning. At the same time, I trust that we recognize that this gathering, although virtual, and the methodology with which this gathering has been shaped in terms of regional conversation, bringing the wisdom and knowledge and the experiences from across the globe. And the fact that this was meant to be a gathering in South Africa. May this be the start of that international gathering of African and its diaspora to move towards and to live into the resistance that this time invites us to. So thank you very much. Just a reminder, folks, that feel free to use the chat for questions or comments that you may want to make. We will harvest the chat as part of our listening and our work going forward. It is my pleasure as well this morning to introduce to you as our second speaker, Dr. Francina Yotani. Dr. Yotani is the senior lecturer at the Theological School in Jayapura, West Papua. She holds a PhD in educational administration and explores various subjects in her research. She also works as a consultant for the Partnership Desk of the Commission of Justice and Peace and Integrity for Creation at the GKI Synod Office. Through her activism, she speaks in various local, regional, and international arena on anti-racism in Christian perspective. She's also a researcher for Indigenous rights for education, leadership, management, and higher education in Papua during COVID-19 pandemic, and with regards to the LGBT community. Dr. Yotani, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and I invite you now to speak to us.
Thank you very much for the time and opportunity that given to me to raise the voice from West Papua. As our actors sing a song that I am a man, I am Papua with the curly hair, black skin color. I am Papua to describe himself. That's what we as a Papuan describe ourselves also here in the land of Papua. So Papua, West Papua is part of the Papua New Guinea island, which is divided into two parts. West Papua, which I come from, that part of Indonesia, and the eastern part that's called Papua New Guinea, independent country. So we call ourselves Melanesians, and part of the Melanesians country in the Oceania is Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Island, Nauru, Tuvalu, New Caledonia, and PNG. So from the history, the map of history, the migration, we found out that we originally coming from Africa. Africa is the motherland of us too. So when I am invited to talk on this very, very appreciate opportunity meeting, I bring us as a Papuan to the Africa, to the motherland, to be recognized as a African people also, diaspora. The Papuan land is part of the land we would like to have a peace on it. However, what we are find today, it is the land with the conflict. It is started during Cold War, when the geopolitics tension that leads to World War II. West Papua was under Dutch territory at the time, and then with auspice of the United Nations, and they are doing act of free choice, one man, one vote. It wasn't applied out of 700,000 populations. They only pick up 1,025 people to vote in favor of Indonesia. Starting in 1969. And then because of this situation, I would like also to pick up one research that doing by Indonesian scholars, that the parties were concerned with the problem in Papua are Netherlands, Indonesian, and the United States. Papuans never involved at all in the whole process of decision-making about themselves and their future. The reenactment was relevant to the historical rectification demands and give encouragement to the Indonesian government to show a great spirit to involve the people of Papua in the whole decision-making about Papua. So the issue in Papua is actually about political issue. Now we talk about land of peace versus conflict of interest in this land, that based on the natural resources that the land has, we experience human rights violation, torture, extrajudicial killing, assassination, racial discrimination, colonization, no freedom of expression. There is a political prisoners, heavy human rights violations such as Abepura blood, Was Your Blood, Biak blood, Paniai blood, Wamena blood. This area becomes special military operation area. It is hard to think that human rights exist for Papuan in many aspects of life. Today, we talk also about liberation and healing. Liberation and healing from our concern, anxiety. We could express feeling and pride to the land and to its people. Harmonious life circle where environment is part of our human well-being. Today, Papua is lung of the world after Amazon. We have a triangle of coral reef of the world. How we can preserve the world with this to be a land of the world and the triangle of the coral reef of the world if we are under discrimination, being colonized. We cannot contribute to the world if our life as a Papuan under threat. Papua is one of the places in the world which is close to the international journalists and media. We are hoping that UN High Commissioner of Human Rights could visit this place. Black Lives Matter exists for Papuan today. Thank you very much for the time that given to me to share the voice from Papua. You are our brother and sister. Your pain is our pain. Our pain is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Dr. Yotani, for a piece of the puzzle, piece of the story that it's important for us to be reminded of. And we're grateful for your presence with us today and your presentation to us. Going to invite Reverend Angelique Walker-Smith to join us and to share with us what the next part of this today will be.
Yes, Reverend Blair, thank you so much. I'm having a bit of a challenge with my camera, not to worry, it will be fixed momentarily, I think. Just one moment, please. Oh, and there I am. Okay. Reverend Blair, thank you so much. And to our keynote speakers, surely, as you stopped and paused, Reverend Blair, this is a time for all of us to pause. We have indeed in this moment expanded the narrative and decolonized the narrative. And that is part of what this conference is all about, is telling our stories, making our voices known as people of Africa and of African descent. To hear Dr. President Mbeki say that all of us share a heritage of being of African descent, African identity. It is so amazingly heartwarming to know that our brothers and sisters in the Pacific share this kinship and affinity with all people of African descent. Some may not have heard this before, but it's time we claim our narrative. And we have heard that today. Of course, Dr. Sir Hilary Beckles continues to lend his voice to this discussion of decolonizing the narrative. And so we do thank both of our speakers for helping us to live into this moment with the kind of knowledge that belongs not only to people of Africa and African descent, but to the world, so that the world may know who we are and whose we are. Thank you again, Reverend Blair, for your leadership this morning. Also, thank you to our keynote speakers. I always thank my co-convener, the Reverend Frank Ciccone, and the international team, and all of those who have worked together to bring us to this moment. We are truly being blessed. So now the conversation continues. We have an outstanding roundtable panel that will further engage us in decolonizing knowledge. Again, deepening the narrative that is ours and that is also global. We are very honored to have this panel to come, after which we will have our breakaway panels, in which we will go deeper into two smaller panel groupings for further reflection. And for all of us to keep in mind that everything that we are doing this week will lead to the manifesto declaration of next steps. And so please, please feel free to write in the chat your responses, your questions, your clarifications. The leadership teams take that seriously. And as Reverend Blair has already stated, will be harvested for the way forward. Again, thank you, Reverend Blair, for leading us into this very moment. And now it is my honor, it is my joy to bring to you the speakers for our next panel. We are very blessed to have distinguished guests who will come to us and speak. We begin with the introduction of Mr. Larry Olamofe, who is the former deputy head as well as advisor for combating racism and xenophobia, training coordinator for the OSCE and the ODIHR's Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department. He ran the portfolio of racism and xenophobia, providing advice to various governments on issues such as intolerance against Christians, hate incidents, and hate crimes across the OSCE region. He also developed, coordinated, and provided trainings for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges, and also civil society organizations on responding to and prevention of hate crimes and European and domestic anti-discrimination law. Prior to this OSCE work, Larry Olamofe ran the Human Rights Education Department as the human rights trainer at the European Roma Rights Center, the ERRC, in Budapest, Hungary, and was an associate professor offering courses on nationalism, social theory, race and racism. Yes, critical race theory, political science, and international human rights at the universities of San Francisco, Budapest, and the Institute of Social and European Studies of the Szanszévesi, Hungary. He has also written a series of articles on the topics of Roma rights, race and racism, hate crimes, cultural theories of race and ethnicity, and modern identities, and contemporary human rights education and development issues and challenges. Today, we also welcome Dr. Krista Johnson, who is the director of the Center for African Studies and an associate professor at the Department of African Studies at the historic Howard University in Washington, D.C. She has lived and traveled extensively throughout Southern Africa In 2012, she completed a Fulbright Fellowship based at the Center for the Study of HIV and AIDS at the University of Botswana. She currently serves on a number of advisory and selection committees for international programs and fellowships, including Howard University's Fulbright American Association for International Programs and Fellowships. Again, she has been associated also with Women's International Fellowship Review with the Fulbright program. She has also held consultancies with the United States Agency for International Development and the US State Department, and is regularly asked to lecture at the Foreign Service Institute. We also welcome Mr. Robert Kafetz from Chicani, who is a lecturer in public policy and also a political commentator activist, and the author of Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation, the Politics Behind the Must Fall Movements. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, having completed his master's in public policy degree in 2017, and he completed a bachelor in social science degree at the University of Cape Town in 2015, specializing in public policy, public administration, and economics. He is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and Mandela Washington Fellow, a Chevening Scholar, a former Master's Fellow at the Public Affairs Research Institute, one of Mail and Guardian's top 200 young people, 2016, for civil society, and an Obama Africa program leader for 2019. He previously worked as the national president of Nkulu Federhead, a nonpartisan youth organization focused on deepening democracy and enhancing social cohesion in South Africa. He also worked as a strategist at Megatech, an emerging technology consulting firm. I might add, we have the great pleasure of having him on our international and host team of the AAD Manchester Conference, and he has been one of the primary architects of our technology engagement that allows all of us to be here in this moment. We also welcome Professor Pedro Lava Acosta. Professor Acosta holds a master and PhD in theology from PPG EST Sao Leopoldo, Brazil. He is also a has a postdoctorate in education and is the adjunct professor of the University of International Integration of Afro-Brazilian Misophonia, UNILAB. He is currently the director of the Institute of Humanities and Letters at UNILAB and the permanent professor of the Masters in African History, Indigenous Peoples, and Black Cultures at the State University of Bahia. He has also written several articles in scientific journals in Brazil abroad, and 3 books on the themes of African history and the Afro-Negro theological thought, as well as several book chapters. Dear friends, we are so honored to have such distinguished guests today to speak to us on this roundtable. It is now my joy to invite them to come and to speak in their own way for about 10 minutes each, and then we will have some Q&A as well. Let us begin with Dr. Krista Johnson, and then I will introduce the next speaker who will follow her. Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Reverend Frank Chikane, and the other organizers of this really important and timely conference. And thank all of the participants and the speakers who came before. I've very much enjoyed the first 2 days' sessions. Sorry, let me just get to my slides here. So I'm really pleased to be here. I think, and I assumed, I guess, that maybe part of the reason why I was invited was my HBCU connections and my connections to Howard. So I'm going to try and expand my discussion a bit beyond that. But certainly I think considering and reflecting on the not just the historical role, but the future role of HBCUs is an important discussion to engage in. So I want to begin really with the events of the summer of 2020, even though, as most participants know, the Black Lives Matter movement began or was formed in 2013 after the murder of Trayvon Martin. The summer of 2020 was really quite pivotal in the sense that it's really reflected perhaps the most significant racial justice and civil rights protests in the United States in over a generation. And this was spurred, of course, by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, among others in particular. But I want to hone in on one significant event or action that occurred during the summer of 2020. And this was actually at Princeton, on the university campus of Princeton University, where the Board of Trustees there took a remarkable about turn and decided to remove the name of Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States and President of Princeton University, from its School of Public and International Affairs, as well as from its residential Wilson College. The Board of Trustees reconsidered its earlier decision to not remove Wilson's name, as the tragic killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others drew renewed attention to racism's detrimental and pervasive history in the United States. Princeton's president at the time in last year stated that Wilson's
No ano
racism,
passado, o presidente Princeton disse.
That Wilson's racism was significant and consequential, even by the standards of his own time. And it's important to note that this decision on the part of the university's board was prompted by a 5-year student-led campaign by the Black Justice League at Princeton University. And Princeton's decision was perhaps the most significant dismantling of an emblem of American racism and empire in the current national conversation on racial injustice and racist symbols. It also is significant in that it provided an opening to connect America's racist and imperial pasts, frequently omitted in contemporary debates surrounding the movement for Black lives. So here we have an instance of, in essence, an effort by the Black Justice League to demythologize dominant history, dominant American history in particular, which glorifies Woodrow Wilson as a visionary and proponent of self-government, while obscuring the fact that his racism and racial paternalism drove much of his policies at home and abroad. So I think it's both apt and important to link this, these efforts to demythologize history with the era of the Manchester Pan-African Conference, but also with the collection of Pan-African scholars and public intellectuals that really emerged during the Manchester era. I think it's important to highlight, I guess, as a scholar at an HBCU, the HBCU contributions to the Manchester Conference. Of course, people know that it was Du Bois and George Padmore who had organized the conference. And this was really the first Pan-African conference that kind of shifted the focus more really to the emerging African leaders, right, on the African continent. And there were some interesting and significant shifts that were represented by this conference. But I would say that the HBCU connections, I think, are important to just highlight. George Padmore actually studied at Howard for a time when he first came to the United States in 1925, and had strong connections and ties with a number of Howard scholars, including Ralph Bunche, who was his mentor, Alain Locke, Rayford Logan, and a bunch of others. Of course, Du Bois was the founder of the Atlanta School of Sociology, but also a frequent participant, and not just visitor, but really resident at Howard University as well during this time. Also, of the three future African leaders that attended the Pan-African Conference, both Hastings Banda and Kwame Nkrumah were graduates of HBCUs. So the connections there, of course, are very strong. But what's also, of course, important is to recognize the importance of Black intellectuals' creation of really a Black counter-public sphere, and how activism and intellectual scholarship at this time were seen to go very much hand in hand. And we see this not just in the work of Du Bois, but in the work of countless others, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, Eric Williams, Rayford Logan, Alain Locke, Merce Tate, the list goes on. So I think just to stick with my theme of HBCUs for just a quick moment here, what's significant as well about the HBCU connection is that there were a number of conferences and events that took place, particularly on Howard's campus in the run-up to the Manchester Conference, which really kind of foregrounded and really, I think, began the conversations around some of the theoretical and intellectual debates that found themselves into the kind of final paper, or the final proposals that emerged from the Manchester Conference. Things like world unity and federation and federalism, and constructing or thinking of the international system beyond the nation state, or forms of political community and organization beyond the nation state. Those were debates and discussions that were being had on Howard's campus in the years before the Manchester Conference. Sorry, I've lost my place here. So that's an important point, but also just the role of HBCUs as these a kind of a site of decolonial knowledge production. Obviously, that wasn't their mission at the time of their creation. But what's really significant in terms of the public intellectuals that emerged at this time is that they really used historically Black universities, which were segregated sites and spaces, to promote and to push a decolonial agenda and decolonial forms of knowledge production. And this was in the form of conferences that were had. This was in the forms of public meetings and engagements that were had, as well as in the form of journals and other publications that emerged from these campuses as well. I would also say, in terms of HBCUs, is to recognize that, early on there was an understanding and a commitment to blurring the lines between African American, and Black studies. So significantly, on Howard's campus, and this is the case, Howard actually had a department and a program of African studies before it had a program of African American studies. And in fact, it was Alain Locke who was pushing for an Institute of African Studies in the 1920s, so early on, and understanding this to be really a very global research agenda that he was trying to promote at that particular time. So another significant contribution of the Manchester era scholars was their commitment to demythologizing history. They were committed to challenging colonial and Eurocentric interpretations of peripheral societies, and did so through a deliberate epistemological and methodological commitment to privilege the perspectives of the colonized, the marginalized, and the excluded. By recognizing that the histories and the trajectories of the metropole and the periphery are intimately entangled, their work offers a counterpoint to normative histories that separate, for example, capitalist industrialization from the practice of slavery. Specifically as well, these scholars destabilized and deconstructed hegemonic notions of modernity and of the West. In particular, a significant focus of much of their work at this time was the system of slavery, but also the agency of the enslaved. These scholars offered as well a relational analysis in theorizing questions of race ordering, hierarchy, and exclusion, particularly in the international system. Their analysis of the World War II era was one of transnational and transatlantic connections, in which they hone in on three processes that have historically undergirded the unequal global order, that being theft of land, theft of labor, and violence. And thus they connect the experiences of darker peoples throughout the world. They also diverge sharply with the mainstream political thinking and theorizing on fascism at the time by engaging seriously with the racialized politics of fascism and connecting anti-fascism to anti-colonialism and struggles against racial oppression in the United States. So these scholars advanced as well a public intellectual model by linking their scholarship and teaching with intellectual activism. This cohort of Black radical scholar activists engaged the national and global Black public around a variety of salient issues of the day and forged meaningful personal and professional networks cemented in the community. In essence, they sought to make the social sciences relevant to social change. So what we can learn from one of the things we can learn from the relational analyses and methodology of the Pan-African intellectuals of the Manchester era, particularly in response to emerging conditions of global connectivity, is that, as Akosua Ampofo argues, the erasure of Black lives by police shootings of Black people in the US should be read as related to the erasure of African lives crossing the desert to Europe, which should be read as related to the beatings of, or the beating of one of Africa's leading writers, Binyavanga Wainaina in Berlin, which should be read as related to the absence of a single African author in several texts, many texts, in fact, on Africa. So the Black Lives Matter movement today has spurred the rediscovery of the university campus and the classroom as sites of politics and solidarity. It has sparked efforts to reclaim and redefine race as an oppositional discourse and framework of analysis. A new global race-sensitive ideology is less defined by geographic boundaries and through the use of new technologies has taken on a fundamentally transnational character. I would say encouragingly, this generation of students and young scholars, whether born and raised on the continent, or whether what we might term the old school African Americans, descendants of the enslaved, or the new school, second generation children of immigrant parents, this new generation are less inclined to draw clear lines between the African experiences on the continent and those in the diaspora. In the contemporary moment, it's the student movements that show us clearly the historical ties to slavery, colonialism, and racism that embody the everyday lives of Black people and the cultures of the academy and knowledge production. They are a continuation of the Pan-African scholars of the Manchester era that were engaged in sustained efforts to create insurgent and resilient forms of thought. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for those very important insights that definitely clarify the narrative and the history relative to Manchester and even today, and particularly the role of HBCUs, historic Black colleges and universities, relative to the preparatory periods, relative to leadership in the Pan-African space. We are grateful for your interventions and look forward to your further remarks as we move through the panel. It is now my joy to bring on Mr. Chikane, who will come and speak to us relative to his work and to thank him again for his leadership in this space around technology and the architecture of communications for all of us to be here in this moment. Mr. Chikani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Walker-Smith. And thank you so much to Dr. Johnson. I found myself once upon a time on Howard campus and had this dream that one day I would do a PhD there or postdocs, and maybe I should pop you a message after this and see what might just happen. But as I was reflecting on what I would talk about today, and I thought maybe I could go deep into my research, maybe I could expand on like this painstaking hours that I spend pretty much every day. I'm trying to unlock certain questions around how do you turn this notion of decolonization, how do you turn this notion of decolonizing knowledge into a form of public policy instrument? The idea of how do you walk into the president's office, and if the president asks you, how do we decolonize this country? You then come up and you say, these are the activities that you would have to embark on. But I thought before I get there, there's a lot of important points that I thought would be good to share with everyone in the room. And just so I prepare everyone, I'm quite provocative at times because I do want to push people to think differently about these questions. So when I was reflecting on this session, the first thought that came to my mind was my experiences of being a young Black male in South Africa. But not just that experience, but the idea of what does it feel like, right? The euphoria of learning how to express your own existence, right? The idea of truly acknowledging that you exist in this world and you matter in this world. Not because someone else has told you that we care about you, not because your family has told you or anyone else, but because you have come to that firm realization that you are important and you exist in this world. And why I bring that point up is that in South Africa, for many of you who don't know, there was this student movement that started in 2015 called Rhodes Must Fall. Now, I was based at the University of Cape Town. The University of Cape Town was primarily a white institution, primarily with white students. And you had Black students on campus who were the minority on campus. Now, in other parts of the world, that might be okay and normalized, but in South Africa, it's a bizarre situation. But it happens a lot of the time, where public spaces, educational spaces, you find that often the Black majority ends up as the minority within these elite spaces. And you could always feel this tension erupting. You could always feel this tension of how do we exist in a space that doesn't want us to exist in our full expression of ourselves? And out of that energy, out of that frustration, you have this movement called Rhodes Must Fall. And Rhodes Must Fall was focused on a statue and taking down the statue, but the statue was less of the issue. What was really at stake for thousands of us on campus at the time was understanding the idea of what does it mean to be young Black in a democratic South Africa? What does it mean to be a young Black individual on the African continent in the 21st century? And what does it mean to defend your future? Right, to defend your future from being erased by others. And it got us then thinking about what does it mean to really decolonize knowledge? There's the one activity of going off and finding out the hidden texts that people have put away in some dark corner, written by some fantastic African and African diaspora writers. That is one activity of bringing that back into the center, bringing that back into the light of the world so that more people can learn from these knowledge bases. And that is an extremely important exercise. But what we realized was in order to do that exercise, you had to first realize that you didn't know, right? That you don't know what you don't know, right? Because you hadn't gotten to that point of expressing your existence, of understanding that because I exist in this world, I should find out more about why I exist in this world. And what we learned from that exercise was that we found that a lot of people, we use this phrase, was sleepwalking through society and sleepwalking through life. They were moving and flowing with the world in a manner that was dictated upon them. And we find that, at least through our deliberations and discussions, that this is the activities that a lot of Africans find themselves in as a collective group. Obviously, we have individuals who are able to break free, who are able to break apart. We have African diaspora who are doing amazing things, but for the vast majority, our lives are dictated by others. The decisions that we make are dictated by others. So it gets us then thinking of what does it mean then to decolonize knowledge and to decolonize our societies, and how does this intersect with Black Lives Matter? And I think the first important point that comes out of my research is, and it's a simple point, and the first one is simply having a decolonized mind, right? Simply being aware that the world in which you observe, the world that you see, the world that you live in is hidden, right? Or the certain aspects of it is hidden. Simply realizing that and decolonizing your mind the way that Ngugi wa Thiong'o would describe does not necessarily translate to a society that is decolonized, right? So you could have thousands of people walking the planet believing that they've decolonized their mind, but that activity doesn't necessarily generate into a decolonized society. And the opposite holds true, right? That you could have a society, a nation, a state that formally liberates itself, right? We saw the wave of decolonization from the 1950s to the 1970s that swept across the African continent. And what we found was, even though these countries were able to say we are able to self-determine, it did not translate into them being decolonized as a society. Achieving this idea that you're no longer a colonial state and having the ability to dictate your laws and have democracy does not mean that you're free. And we now have enough evidence to show that that is not the case. That we're constantly fighting to dictate and express our existence as people on the continent, as people of the African diaspora. So it got us thinking then at that point, at least me, around how decolonizing can be then manifested within society. And when I thought about that, it then brought us to this question of Black Lives Matter and how these ideas intersect. And I've had an interesting experience with Black Lives Matter. And it speaks to some of the challenges that we have with Pan-Africanism, that often Pan-Africanism can have, even within it, dominant thoughts of what a Pan-African or what a Black life is. And that because of Western capitalism, because of the way that media is represented in our society, certain forms of Blackness are often privileged over other forms of Blackness. And it's very subtle, right? It is very subtle, or sometimes it is in your face. And we faced that challenge last year at the beginning of COVID-19, just as the protests were erupting in the United States after the killing of George Floyd. We then had an incident in this country where, because of COVID-19 and the lockdown, the military killed an innocent man who was in his home, Collins Shaba. And the question that was posed to society was, why is it that the focus around Black Lives Matter became centered around the death of George Floyd within the South African continent and not centered on the death of Collins Shaba, right? This idea that the military can come into your home and kill you and nothing gets done about it. And it poses an interesting dilemma that we face as everyone in this room of how do we come together with our vastly different experiences, yet extremely similar experiences of what it means to be Black in our society. The idea that even though we might live on different continents and face racism and prejudice and sexism in different formats, that we're still connected without drowning out each other's voices. That there's no homogenous idea of being Black across society or which Black life matters more across our global context, but how do we erase that idea that there's a hierarchy and bring each other back together? The humility of those who do get that prominence, the big media, to be able to say, how do we acknowledge the deaths of those millions of people who are traveling from the African continent, desperately trying to get to Europe? How do we highlight their lives as much as possible? How do we highlight the names of Collins Shabas of the world across the globe? And through that activity, it becomes quite uncomfortable. We dealt with it in Rhodes Must Fall, and one of the things that I said was when they came to us, Black Lives Matter came to Rhodes Must Fall, they wanted to help us strategize. And I remember the phrase I used was, I don't think we could do that. Because if we did that, we would be using the strategies of a minority group within a dominantly white country, fighting for their existence. But you can't use that logic if you're the majority within your society fighting for your existence, because that shouldn't be the case. And when you look at Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora and the African continent as a whole, we far outnumber the majority of this world. Maybe not far outnumber, but our pure numbers allow us to ask the question of how do we then start thinking about our existence, not because it is determined by someone else, but because we determine it ourselves? Now, this is not a new thought in any particular way. The entire notion of Pan-Africanism, the entire notion of decolonial thought, it aspires towards this, right? We have been working towards this moment throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. But the question is then, how have we not succeeded just as yet? And what does success look like? Does success look like we have left someone behind? Does it mean that every single Black person on this continent, every single African diaspora, every single person of African descent should be considered as free? Or should certain people be considered free and then free the rest? And I think this intersection between understanding that decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing society is not just about finding new knowledge, but it's about learning how to express yourself as something new. And how do you link that with the strategies, right, of maintaining connections between Pan-African bodies, maintaining connections between those of African descent in a manner that allows us to strategize for the benefit of all of us without leaving anyone behind. And I think it needs a revolutionary mindset. And this will be my last point on this. The research that I'm doing showcases that there is a need for a different type of mindset around what it means to be free. That simply having a democracy does not mean that you're free in the global society in which coloniality ensures that even though you are free, you are still impoverished, you're still stuck in slavery, you're still stuck in this notion of catching up with the rest of the world. The belief that somehow by virtue of our existence, we are behind other countries, we are behind other nations, because we do not have the same resources, therefore, we've been told that you are less than. And I think the first step is for this intersection is a revolutionary change in mindset. And I think the second point at that point is how we understand Pan-Africanism as a form of emergence. So one of my fields, and final thought, one of my fields of research is around complexity economics and the idea that the whole can't be broken down to its individual components. And one of the critiques I have of Pan-Africanism is often we think is that if we all come together, that is enough. If we all come together to discuss, that is enough. And we've now learned that it is not enough because our society hasn't fundamentally changed. So the question then becomes, how do we then come together to create something greater than the sum of our parts? And what does that look like? What does that energy look like? So as Hilary Beckles was asking the question of how do we come together in one conference, my retort would be, how do we then leave that conference to go change society? And I thought those would be some of the words I would share with those in the room around this idea of expressing yourself as a whole human being as an act of a decolonial technique towards your existence. The idea that even though all Black lives matter across the continent, we can't fall into the trap that certain Black lives, because of their proximity to certain forms of knowledge, to certain forms of capitalism, matter more than others. And how do we ensure that those partnerships are brought together so that we create something that is greater than the sum of our parts? Because without that type of technique, without that type of approach, I believe that we'll be doomed for the 22nd century, that we'll be still having a discussion about the plight of our people. And what I desperately want is to be sitting with my great-great-granddaughter, hopefully technology allows me to live that long, with my great-granddaughter asking me and saying, what a beautiful world we live in, where I can freely breathe, where I can freely express myself as who I am as a young Black woman. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Mr. Shikani, for those provocative insights. Those insights certainly push us into thinking about what really is a self-determined destiny that is not just reactionary to the previous histories that we've known, but how it uplifts the journeys of our own vision as people of Africa and African descent for going forward. How do we live into our fullest humanity in this world, knowing that our children's lives are at stake? You have certainly pushed us to think more deeply about those issues. And certainly this is what we came to this conference for, is to think deeply around what it means in this moment to pursue the future together based on this amazing legacy of Pan-Africanism that has been self-determined, that has opposed the dominant narrative, that we can build on for our future. So thank you, Mr. Chikani. You have certainly helped us to probe more deeply as well. We are grateful. We now want to turn to our third speaker, and our third speaker is the Professor Pedro Leiva Acosta. He's already been properly introduced. Mr. Professor Acosta, the floor is yours.
Bom dia a todos e todas, boa noite. Bom dia, uma boa noite para todas as pessoas nesse planeta Terra. É com muita alegria que nos apresentamos aqui. Eu sou o professor Pedro Acosta Leiva e quero primeiramente agradecer a oportunidade e o convite da reverenda Angelique Walker e do Dr. Frank Chicane. Assim mesmo, quero agradecer o convite feito por las organizadoras regionais, a professora doutora Maricel Mena Lopes, a professora mestre Selenir Kronbauer e a reverenda Eliade Santos. Agradeço essa oportunidade porque Garvey falava para todos nós, África para os africanos, no continente e na diáspora. Nós falamos desde a diáspora de milhões de pessoas que foram trasladados de forma criminosa e genocida para o continente americano e para outros continentes. Não queremos dizer que aqui na América, especialmente no Brasil, o país onde tem a maior população de afrodescendente fora do continente, nosso maior desafio para o século XXI será a relação entre quilombismo e panafricanismo. Entendendo o quilombismo ou palenquismo como o marrons, como a resistência negra no continente americano, resistência negra em contra da hegemonia da branquitude e em contra da perversidade do capitalismo e do colonialismo que nos agride e nos explora. O maior desafio será, então, a relação entre quilombismo e panafricanismo. O panafricanismo como uma ideologia que nos une, que nos provoca e nos desafia. Eu gostaria de compartilhar com vocês, com os senhores e as senhoras, que a descolonização ela passa profundamente por outros níveis e outras seções e outras áreas da vida humana. Kwame Nkrumah falava: dá-me o poder político e as demais coisas serão acrescentadas. Mas depois ele percebeu que a libertação, a independência dos países africanos, não somente passava por administração e por la política, ela passa também por el domínio financeiro, por la autonomia econômica e ela passa muito por la descolonização do pensamento. Não haverá liberdade em nenhuma parte. Não haverá emancipação dos seres humanos se não tem emancipado a forma de pensar. E para isso, o Nelson Mandela, o grande Nelson Mandela, falava que nossa principal arma é a educação. No Brasil e em América Latina, esse movimento de descolonização ele passa eminentemente por 3 grandes tradições ou 3 grupos de memória. Em primeiro lugar, a descolonização passa por um movimento negro. Isto é, a sociedade civil dos afrodescendentes da diáspora, isto é, da 6ª região da África, nos estamos organizando, hemos venido nos organizando a partir do século, com os quilombos, os palenques, as comunidades, mas agora politicamente se ha organizado através dos movimentos negros, e esses movimentos negros agora eles compartilham uma densidade que faz 30 anos não se via. E é que os movimentos negros agora não são somente movimentos negros de base, mas também tem acadêmicos, intelectuais, pensadores que andam junto da população. A distância entre a academia e o movimento negro se ha encurtado. Por outro lado, nós temos as comunidades tradicionais negras no Brasil e em toda a América, e essas comunidades tradicionais podemos mencionar a santeria em Cuba, o candomblé no Brasil, o voodoo haitiano, a capoeira, os diferentes blocos culturais carnavalescos e de recreação, todos eles se estão emancipando e se estão descolonizando, porque aquela ideia de que nossas comunidades tradicionais ainda estão pensando a África como um elemento simbólico, isso já é coisa do passado. Temos pai de santo, sacerdotes e sacerdotisas das comunidades tradicionais que são mestres e doutores, que conhecem os grandes movimentos do panafricanismo e estão engajados, se organizando no panafricanismo, não somente a nível de comunidade local tradicional, mas estão já se relacionando no movimento negro e estão também como professores e professores na academia. Por último, temos um movimento de emancipação, que é um movimento super importante, que está acontecendo em las academias, em las universidades e nas escolas de toda a América Latina. Antigamente, não tão antigo, há menos de 30 anos atrás, há 20 anos atrás, quando eu fui a estudar no Brasil, na universidade, eu era 1 ou 2 negros na sala de aula. Hoje, nós temos uma grande multidão de pessoas afrodescendentes, mulheres negras e homens negros, jovens, estudando. E esses jovens, eles estão mudando o pensamento, estão se descolonizando, e o conhecimento que estava reservado no movimento negro e nas mobilizações sociais, ele está passando para as universidades brasileiras. E em toda a América Latina, ele tem um caráter eurocêntrico, onde a branquitude ela acredita todo o conhecimento. Agora, em este momento, em el século XXI, há um grande contingente de professores e professoras negras que estão introduzindo o conhecimento de África de forma descolonizada. Estão introduzindo a história de mulheres como Alice Alexandre Quinot, a primeira mulher que lá em 1900, em Londres, junto com Silver Williams, organizaram a primeira conferência pan-africana. Foi uma mulher sul-africana, uma mulher Zulu, junto com um caribenho, Silver Williams, e depois um afro-norte-americano, Dubois, né? William Dubois, que organizaram essa primeira conferência. E aqui vou dizer que a nossa emancipação política, administrativa, nossa emancipação, ela passa diretamente por o reconhecimento de que as mulheres estão na vanguarda. Então, Alice Quinot, uma Zulu, em 1900, e um negro do Caribe, e um outro negro, que já era um intelectual respeitado, William Dubois, eles organizaram a primeira conferência internacional de 1900 na Inglaterra. nós temos um movimento muito forte no Brasil de reorganização nas academias, os intelectuais negros, e não só intelectuais negros. Eu trabalho em uma universidade que congrega estudantes e professores brasileiros de várias partes do Brasil, mas também dos países da CPLP, dos países africanos de língua oficial portuguesa. Eles estão estudando em uma universidade chamada Unilab, aqui na Bahia, que é o lugar onde está a maior quantidade de afro-brasileiros concentrado. Então, a academia brasileira é um elemento fundamental para que exista uma relação entre a resistência negra, que a gente pode chamar de quilombismo, e o panafricanismo. Enquanto existir uma mulher, um homem negro, fora da academia, sendo morto, como no Brasil, 27.000 jovens negros morrem por ano no Brasil. Cada ano, cada 12 meses, morrem 27.000 jovens que podiam estar estudando nas universidades e emancipando-se e participando da construção de uma sociedade mais justa, de uma sociedade, como se fala no Fórum Social Mundial, um outro mundo é possível. Mas a gente sempre repite, um outro mundo é possível se os africanos e africanas do continente e os africanos e africanos da diáspora, porque nós na diáspora somos a 6ª região da África, reconhecido por cada um de nós e também pela União Africana, nós precisamos, sim, trabalhar junto em las academias, em los movimentos sociais e em las comunidades tradicionais, sejam eles candomblé, santeria, igrejas negras em várias partes do continente americano e outras partes do mundo onde os negros estamos, é necessário que a gente se junte e saiba que as mulheres como Alice Quinó Zulu, que organizou a primeira conferência pan-africana, e Amy Garvey, a mulher que estava na base da organização da Conferência de Manchester, porque não haverá emancipação. Já Amílcar Cabral falava, e Eduardo Mongelani falava, não haverá emancipação para o homem e a mulher negra até que a mulher negra africana, a mulher negra na diáspora, seja emancipada. Então, nossa força depende, sim, da academia, dos movimentos negros, mas depende especialmente da emancipação da mulher. Então, eu deixo aqui meus comentários e estou aberto ao diálogo e a perguntas, porque me parece que estamos em um momento de construção de nossa própria história e a articulação que nos han negado, a articulação que nos han negado dos povos da diáspora com os povos do continente africano. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for your very important interventions from Latin America. As we know, Brazil has one of the largest concentrations of people of African descent globally. And so what you are doing there with your work and all of the ideas that you presented in this moment certainly matter in this conversation. We are very grateful. I would like to go to each of the panelists to say, would you be willing in this moment to offer a question to one of the other panelists that has spoken that provoked your thinking relative to what it is that you are doing in your presentations discussed? So I would like to begin with Mr. Chikane and then Dr. Johnson and end up with Professor Acosta for these brief responses to each other. Just one particular point that you really feel you might want to really respond to based on what you have presented. And then we will look to the chat to see if there are any particular questions and then we will go to our breakaway panels. So over to you, Mr. Chikane, and then over to you, Dr. Johnson, and then Professor Acosta, we come back to you. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much. As I was listening to Professor Acosta, he did a fantastic elaboration of the history of the struggle. And I think one of the important points that he really noted on is this notion that you can't really find this freedom until the Black female or the Black woman of the African diaspora, the woman of the African diaspora also find their freedom as well. And it's often an underrepresented point. And over the past 10 years, and maybe it's because I've only started reading over the past 10, 12 years now, but it has been growing and growing in how loud it is. And when you think of a movement such as Black Lives Matter, one of the forgotten aspects of it, and we hope it never gets forgotten, we have to keep remembering it, is that it was started by Black women in particular. When we think about our movement, Rhodes Must Fall, it was started by Black women in particular. And often the problem that we face is that the men of movements often take up a lot of the space. This is a lesson that I learned 5 years ago when I was kicked out of a room because I was taking up too much space. Right. So the question that I would have for Professor Acosta when he eventually responds is this idea of how do we stop that history repeating itself of males taking up the space or of men taking up the space, especially those who stand in solidarity for the Pan-Africanist beliefs that we have in the future. And maybe Dr. Johnson could also answer that as well. That'll be the question I would have for Pedro, for Professor Acosta, and as one of my final remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chikane. Over to you, Dr. Johnson, please.
Thank you. Well, I was actually going to ask, I guess maybe a bit of a similar question in terms of actually asking, I was going to ask it of Mr. Chikane in terms of maybe elaborating a bit on the role of Black women in particular in terms of the kind of, I guess, conscientization, but also just, you know, kind of the construction of really kind of a new Pan-African, you know, kind of consciousness, right, in the moment that we are in today and kind of their role in that. So, but my second question then would be, and I guess this is perhaps to both as well, is the challenge of continuing to kind of engage in or construct or have our this kind of Pan-African discussion and dialogue in the context of an international system dominated by nation states, right? And so then I'm curious what others see as what are the openings or the opportunities to forge alternative, you know, political communities. Obviously we have, and I know Professor Acosta, you know, was talking about the AU and, you know, kind of, and now we have ACTFA and other kind of ways of kind of extra, I guess, or international or multinational, you know, institutions, but we still operate within a framework of the nation state, especially when it comes to the individual, right? And so, especially when it comes to the individual claiming certain rights and certain protections. So how do we, it's all well and good for us to come together and say, we're all of African descent, you know, kumbaya, I embrace that culture, I embrace that heritage, I embrace that legacy. But, you know, when it comes to, okay, from whom or to what body or to what grouping or to what identity am I going to claim my citizenship rights? Am I going to claim, you know, any number of rights and responsibilities for that matter? We still do that within a nation state framework. And how do you overcome that? Because isn't that surely always going to be the kind of, you know, we can go so far, but only so far unless we kind of figure out how to address that. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Johnston. If we may go to Professor Acosta, and then we come back to Mr. Chikane just to briefly respond to your observations, particularly around women of African descent. Thank you. Professor Acosta, please.
Sim, muito obrigado por los comentários, muito obrigado também por as perguntas. São perguntas super importantes, porque o que os homens, especialmente os homens pretos, podemos fazer com relação a sair do discurso da promoção à mulher negra, à mulher africana, para ir para a prática. Bom, dois elementos fundamentais a gente está fazendo. O primeiro, necessitamos de uma justiça histórica, ou uma justiça historiográfica. Existe no panafricanismo, em los homens que falam do panafricanismo, existe uma grande injustiça contra as mulheres. Quando se fala do movimento panafricanista, geralmente se fala em termos patriarcais e machistas, mas é uma injustiça dos historiadores, não do movimento panafricano. Se a gente vai à primeira conferência de 1900, a gente vê ali uma mulher Zulu, sudafricana, que é a principal organizadora do movimento e da conferência. Mas isso ha sido esquecido pela historiografia panafricana. Quando a gente vai ao movimento garveyista, esquecemos de Henrietta Victon Davis, de Amy Garvey, de Susana Cesar e de outras mulheres que dentro do panafricanismo e da negritude, elas jogaram um papel especial na construção de lo que a gente tem hoje como panafricanismo. Então, a primeira coisa que a gente tem que fazer é uma justiça histórica. Precisamos continuar pensando em Du Bois, em Marcus Garvey, em Silver William, mas a gente precisa pensar nas mulheres que estavam junto. Essa é a primeira imagem do panafricanismo que nós precisamos rever. Não continuar repetindo as injustiças históricas dos historiadores do panafricanismo. Em segundo lugar, eu fico muito feliz, porque aqui em América Latina, as pessoas que estão organizando essa grande conferência que estamos participando, o Renascimento de Manchester, 1945, são a doutora Maricel Mena Lopes, uma mulher negra colombiana, uma teóloga super reconhecida aqui em América Latina, a reverenda Eliade, uma mulher também junta do movimento negro, junta também nos movimentos sociais aqui no Brasil, e reconhecida em América Latina também por sua participação na teologia negra, e a professora Selenir Gonçalves Kronbauer, são as mulheres. Também tem a professora Marília e outras mulheres que são as que estão organizando desde a América Latina o panafricanismo do Renascimento de Manchester. Então, eu acho que nós estamos por um bom caminho. Por outro lado, os homens necessitamos ter, os homens negros, necessitamos ter um mínimo de lo que a gente foi ensinado por nossas mães. Respeito e dignidade pelas pessoas que são a principal raiz do panafricanismo, que são as mulheres. Então, é necessário que nas mesas de palestra, em las decisões de poder, em las eleições para cargo político, também a gente inclua sempre uma justiça de gênero. Uma justiça de gênero. As mulheres têm que estar no mesmo número ou em número maior que nós, homens negros. E somos nós, homens negros, que precisamos pular desse pedestal machista e patriarcal para que las mujeres que están al mismo nivel que nos, elas puedan ser nuestras candidatas para esos cargos y estar en esas mesas. Entonces, me parece que la gente, aquí por lo menos en América Latina, estamos caminhando en esa dirección con un poco de dificultad, mas estamos caminhando. Entonces, desde ese punto de vista, las universidades ya tenemos varias reitoras negras que ya pasaron por las universidades. A nossa sala de aula, por incrível que pareça, a nossa sala de aula tem maior quantidade de mulheres negras que de homens. Então, eu acredito que esse século XXI, ele seja o panafricanismo guiado pelas mulheres. E também eu fiquei muito feliz quando o primeiro contato foi feito por la reverenda Angelique, e o acompanhamento que ela tido, e assim também por sul-africano, né, Franklin. Então, a gente está caminhando em essa renascença do panafricanismo, estamos caminhando com passos femininos. Não haverá emancipação se o passo não é feminino. Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Professor Acosta. Mr. Chikani, very quickly, we need to wrap up this session because it's time to go to our breakaway groups. So very quickly, your last quick response. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Professor Acosta answered one of the questions perfectly well. On the question of the nation states and how we function in that, I think that's the question that we have facing us for the next 50 years, right? That the idea of and we'll talk about it more tomorrow and the next few days, just the idea that can you achieve the type of Pan-Africanism that we want as a world, as we want as a group of African descendants with the current way that our international order is organized? Not to say that we want to throw away the international order, but is it the best structure? Is the nation state the best structure? And what we're finding now is that social movements, because of the advent of technology, because we can communicate with each other a lot faster than ever before, because you can share information and techniques, that social movements are no longer bound to the nations that they exist in. And I think that becomes an interesting question of how do you leverage that instead of relying on the nation state idea to create this idea of freedom and Pan-Africanism. So I believe that might be the answer. I think our current model of nation states isn't, but I think we are slowly finding the tools because of technology and how we express ourselves in that way.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. You certainly have enriched our time together for this very important theme today.